Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the UAE Singapore Business Council's first webinar. Good morning, Your Excellency, Dr. Muhammad Omar Belfaqi, UAE Ambassador to Singapore and Patron of the UAE Singapore Business Council, the Honourable Mr. Lee Yi-shan, Member of Parliament for East Coast GRC and Patron of the UAE Singapore Business Council, Your Excellency Bilahari Kausikan, Chairman of NUS Middle East Institute, our speaker for this morning. Your Excellency Zainal Abidin Rashid, Singapore Non-Resident Ambassador to Kuwait. Your Excellency Kishore Daryanani, Consul General for Democratic Republic of Congo. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this morning, and we hope it will be an enjoyable talk to you. And first and foremost, we would like to welcome Your Excellency, Dr. Muhammad Omar Belfaqi, UAE Ambassador to Singapore and Patron of the UAE Singapore Business Council, for his welcoming speech. Your Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I want first to welcome our Honorable Mr. Lee Yi-shan, Member of Parliament of East Coast GRC and Patron of the UAE Singapore Business Council. And also Your Excellency Bilahari Kausikan, Chairman of UAS Middle East Institute. Also, I want to welcome to our session today His Excellency Zainal Abidin Rashid, Singapore non-resident ambassador to Kuwait. Also, our guest today, Kishore Daryanani, General Counsel for the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ladies and gentlemen, again, I welcome you to the much anticipated talk by His Excellency Bilahari Kausikan, Chairman of the NUS Middle East Institute. His Excellency Bilahari has a reputation of being a sought-after public speaker. He has an impressive track record as a senior diplomat, retiring as the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's an expert of the Indo-Pacific region, and I'm sure you will find his talk insightful. The Indo-Pacific region is strategically very important for UAE as a major purchaser of its oil export. The UAE has also strong political relationship with the major countries in the Indo-Pacific region, with increasing trade and investment linkages. I congratulate the UAE Singapore Business Council in persevering with this breakfast talk series despite the challenges caused by COVID-19. I understand that there are about over 50 participants, some of whom are connecting from UAE. Although it is very early morning in UAE, about 5:35 morning, but I am very happy to see them are connected with from there. I'm delighted that COVID-19 has not been hindrance as people may have been visited. I am sure that you will find His Excellency Bilahari's presentation very informative, and I want to thank him again for participating in the UAE Singapore Business Council Breakfast Series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. May I now please invite Dr. Brian Shager, UAE Singapore Business Council President, to do an introduction to our speaker, His Excellency Bilahari, this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, May. Your Excellency, Dr. Muhammad Omar Belfaqi, UAE Ambassador to Singapore and the Patron of the UAE Singapore Business Council, the Honourable Mr. Lee Yi-shan, Member of Parliament for East Coast GRC and Patron of the UAE Singapore Business Council, Your Excellency Bilahari Kausikan, Chairman of the NUS Middle East Institute and our honoured speaker this morning, Your Excellency Zainal Abidin Rashid, Singapore non-resident ambassador to Kuwait, and Your Excellency Kishore Daryanani, Consul General for the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to our breakfast webinar. You would have seen the video whilst in the waiting room on the UAESBC, its objectives and activities. His Excellency Bilahari was due to address us at the end of March as part of our regular breakfast talk series, which unfortunately had to be rescheduled due to the COVID-19 situation. But I am delighted that we have been able to reinsert his talk, albeit in a different format, through a webinar, which actually has the advantage of having a wider level of participation. Due to the COVID-19 restrictions, we will continue to use the webinar format for the remaining two talks that have been scheduled for the second half of 2020. In early September, we have Dr. Monica Malik, who will deliver a webinar entitled Economic Outlook and Overview of the GCC Impact of COVID-19. In November, I will be presenting the breakfast webinar with the title Understanding the Middle East, Holistic Approach. We are also undertaking our annual oil, petrochemical and logistics panel webinar on 18th August with a focus on the impact of COVID-19. During the week of the UAE National Day, beginning of December, we will hold an investment workshop on UAE food production and processing, in collaboration with Enterprise Singapore, the UAE Embassy, and the Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and other organizations. We look forward to your active participation in all these events. I now have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our esteemed breakfast webinar speaker, His Excellency Bilahari Kausikan, Chairman of the NUS Middle East Institute. His Excellency Bilahari requires no introduction to most of us, but for the benefit of some of our non-Singaporean participants, it will be necessary and important for me to brief you on his most impressive credentials. His Excellency Bilahari is one of Singapore's most prominent political thinkers and diplomatic figures. He has had almost 40 years experience in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including being Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York and ambassador to the Russian Federation. Locally, he was awarded the Public Administration Medal Gold and the Meritorious Service Medal. Internationally, he received the award of the Order of Bernardo O'Higgins from the President of the Republic of Chile and the Oman Civil Merit Order from the late His Majesty Sultan Qaboos. In addition to being a seasoned diplomat, his many accolades include being author of two highly acclaimed books titled, firstly, Singapore is Not an Island, Views on Singapore's Foreign Policy, and a second book titled Dealing with an Ambiguous World. Commenting on his book, Singapore is Not an Island, Views on Singapore's Foreign Policy, the former Deputy Prime Minister, Professor S. Jayakumar, said, Bilahari is one of the finest minds in Singapore's public service. His unvarnished analysis of foreign policy trends is refreshing, as are his thoughts on what they portend for Singapore. He was educated in Raffles Institution, the University of Singapore, and Columbia University in New York. And now it gives me great pleasure to invite our breakfast webinar speaker, His Excellency Bilahari Kausikan, to give his talk. Over to you, Bilahari.
Good morning, everybody. After that overly effusive introduction, what I have to say will probably disappoint you. So I'll try to make it as brief as possible to minimize the risk of disappointment. But anyway, thank you for making time. Ishan, I hope you're all right. Zainul, I hope you're all right too. Brian, you look all right. Excellency, you look wonderful. Anyway, let me get straight to it. I am not going to talk too long. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, and I hope, therefore, to have a dialogue with you through the question and answers rather than a monologue. My topic is geopolitical trends in the Indo-Pacific. And the first point I want to emphasize by way of a framing is let's not get too excited. The global pandemic is a very serious event. There has not been a global pandemic of this scale since the Spanish flu pandemic, which is more than 100 years ago, I think. But let's not get so excited. The middle of a global crisis is not the best time to arrive at balanced geopolitical assessments. And there have been far too many what I would call hyperbolic commentaries on the geopolitical implications of the pandemic. Hyperbolic because I think it is way too premature to draw very firm conclusions about something when you're in the middle of it. Because when you're in the middle of it, for a start, you are responding emotionally to the emotions and passions of the moment rather in a considered manner. Now, with that qualification, let me say that I don't think the direct, and I stress the word direct, geopolitical impact of this pandemic is going to be seminal. It will accelerate existing trends, but it's not, I think, fundamentally going to shift the needle one way or the other. The economic impact, of course, is going to be much more profound. You have seen the figures or the estimates from the World Bank and IMF. They think the world economy is going to contract from somewhere between 3 to 5.2%. And there's going to be a huge knock-on effect. And the indirect impact of the economic fallout is going to be much greater than the direct geopolitical impact. But the indirect economic impact is still playing itself out, and it's really rather premature to come to any conclusion at the present moment. I said a moment ago that it is not going to fundamentally shift the needle, but it's going to accentuate existing trends. And that's certainly clear of what is probably the most important geopolitical axis in the world, which is the US-China relationship. It's certainly not dampened the strategic competition between them, and has given it a sharper edge with all the accusations being traded back and forth. I don't think either the US or China is likely to gain any significant lasting strategic advantage from this pandemic. It will enhance existing proclivities, meaning that if you, in your calculation of national interests, were inclined to be tilted towards China, you will continue to be tilted towards China. But if your calculation led you to the conclusion that you should be tilted towards the US, you will continue that way. And if your calculation was that you should try as far as possible to navigate between these two countries, that is what you will continue to do. However, I think neither the US nor China, for broadly similar but nonetheless different reasons, are going to emerge looking brilliant from this crisis. It's clear now, and I base this not just on Western reports, but on media reports in the PRC media that have since been redacted, but were there anyway, that for a crucial 5 or 6 days, China delayed acknowledging the seriousness of the pandemic, including to their own people, and that was a crucial time because it allowed the virus to spread around the world as many Chinese went off to take Chinese New Year holidays around the world. That said, I think having made that initial mistake, which I don't think was deliberate, it arose from the imperatives of a Leninist system, a communist system, which is always to try to control information among other things rather than release it. Having made that initial mistake, China reacted with great decisiveness and ruthlessness. In effect, they were almost prepared to write off Wuhan, a city of 11 million people. They sealed it off. They gave it what resources they had, and they basically said, not in so many words, you're going to take care of yourself. And because of their ruthless approach to dealing with this, they managed to contain it within a relatively short period of time, which is good for everybody. On the other hand, the US, now I think you have to understand that democracies always are slow to react to crisis. And it was probably slower than absolutely necessary because of the peculiarities of the Trump administration. But having said that, the strength of the US system is really not in Washington, D.C. The strength of the US system is that it is a diffuse system. You can see, having made that initial hesitance, many cities, and that's where the locus of decision was being, reacted quite well and in a fairly coherent manner. Anyway, but none of them comes out looking brilliant. And what is going to be the consequence of this, I think, is that it will enhance mistrust in both these major powers. On the one hand, if you are inclined one way, that inclination will be enhanced. On the other hand, your mistrust of these powers is going to be enhanced. And that mistrust has been validated by quite a number of international opinion surveys. If you ask people in various ways, are the US and China important? Everybody will say yes, of course. But if you ask them in various ways, do you trust these countries? People will say no, not very much. And that's going to be enhanced. What this means is that few people are going to make binary choices in deciding how to position themselves between these two powers. And in fact, no country ever makes binary choices unless it has no chance, no other alternative. So US strategic competition is going to continue. It's going to be sharpened. I don't think either is going to get any particular advantage from this. But I think the probability of war between them, as has been predicted by some rather stupid international relations theories, for example, the Thucydides trap, which I really think is a very stupid theory propounded by an otherwise very distinguished scholar. War is not going to happen for one very simple reason. There is a state of nuclear deterrence between them, and these are both rational countries that are not going to destroy each other and the rest of us. But the only exception for this, and we can talk about it later, is possibly Taiwan. But that said, we have to get used to a new normal of heightened strategic competition between these two countries over the long term. Now, let me say a few words about the US, which we in the Indo-Pacific ought to bear in mind. Now, Mr. Trump is no doubt a disruptive element, but he is represented, he is a symptom as much as a cause, and he represents tendencies that have always been present in American political culture and American foreign policy. Mr. Trump may have accentuated these tendencies, but he didn't invent them. He didn't invent a penchant for unilateralism. It's always been there. He did not invent a preference for bilateralism over multilateralism. It's always been there. He did not invent the skepticism about free trade and a preference for managed trade, which has always been there since the 19th century, when the US first began to be a major trading country. He may accentuate all these things, but he didn't invent them. And these are, since it's a symptom now, of course, I think, long-term trends. If you look at the broad outline of American foreign policy, during the Cold War, the US was willing to bear any burden, pay any price, make any sacrifice to maintain its idea of international order. In the immediate period after the Cold War ended, the US went through a period of hubris when it thought it was the Sony power that mattered, and it made many mistakes, primarily in the Middle East, which the consequences of which are still with us today. In the sense, Mr. Trump, in a very crude way, is the first truly post-Cold War US president who asked himself, as Obama did in a different way, why should I bear any burden, pay any price to maintain international order? I will put myself first. And that's what he has done, and that's what I think is going to continue. We can talk about the US presidential election a little bit if we like, but irrespective of whether Trump is replaced this November or he's replaced in another 4 years, I don't think whoever replaces him, whether Republican or Democrat, is going to be very different in the goals of American foreign policy. It's going to be more transactional. They're not going to pay any price, bear any burden, make any sacrifice for the good of mankind any longer. A new president may speak more moderately. He may make decisions with greater deliberation using the normal decision-making structures that America has. But I don't think the basic direction is going to change. Certainly, US-China competition is not going to change. There is a strong bipartisan consensus over that. And the one thing that the nearly invisible Mr. Biden, who is going to be Mr. Trump's opponent in November, has surfaced to say is to criticize Mr. Trump for being insufficiently tough on holding China responsible for the pandemic. Now let me move to China. It's quite obvious China, like the rest of us, is going to undergo a period of slow growth. How long this period is and how slow, we don't really quite know. There are various statistics being bandied about. I don't very much trust official Chinese statistics. And in fact, Premier Li Keqiang himself is on record as saying he doesn't trust them either. And the rest are just estimates. But I think you can get some idea of the concern of the Chinese leadership if you read Premier Li Keqiang's speech to the recently concluded 2 sessions Liang Hui, right? It's very clear that they were very concerned about social stability because a lot of the speech was about how they are going to maintain jobs, prevent job losses, how they are going to maintain the standard of living of the Chinese people. It's quite clear that if production is resumed, it is patchy, and a lot of migrant workers have not yet completely returned to work for one reason or the other. It's quite clear, although we don't know, we don't have precise figures, that unemployment and underemployment is probably going to increase. And that's all implicit if you read Li Keqiang's speech, and I suggest you do. This has to be framed in the context of a larger problem that China faces. Now, as early as the 18th Party Congress, which was in 2012, the Chinese Communist Party had acknowledged that the growth model, which is essentially based on a huge emphasis on infrastructure development led by SOEs, that had led to that spectacular growth it enjoyed in the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s. That growth model was not sustainable over the long run, and they needed a new growth model. And the next year, in 2013, they did roll out a growth model, which, among other things, had as its core, it envisaged a decisive role for the market in allocation of resources. Very little of that new growth model has been implemented, and what has been implemented has been patchy again. In the meantime, at the 19th Party Congress, which is in 2017, it was quite clear, and it was clear in Mr. Xi Jinping's speech, that one of the most important problems meeting the Chinese Communist Party was to meet the growing expectations of the Chinese people. And that prescribed a very complicated and lengthy domestic agenda. However, And to meet those expectations, you need growth, because it's going to take a long time to meet those expectations. How long, nobody really knows. And it's going to take a lot of resources. How much, nobody really knows. And while China has huge reserves, huge is not infinite, as they themselves are beginning to acknowledge. But in confronting these two facts, one is the old growth model is not sustainable over the long run. Secondly, I have to meet rising expectations of my people. China faces a very fundamental dilemma. It needs a new balance between political control and market efficiency, because more market means, by definition, less control. Now, the choice is not absolute. It's a matter of balance, right? What that new balance is, they are not quite sure, and they are rather nervous. And so far, Mr. Xi Jinping has put his emphasis on control to maintain social stability without actually giving up the search for more reforms. Now, I don't mean by this to suggest that China is going to fail. I don't think China is going to fail. It is a brilliant improviser. It has not confronted that fundamental dilemma, but it is a brilliant improviser. But it does mean that China is in the vicinity of black swans. It's in an area where black swans breed, and we shouldn't be surprised if these creatures appear. In a sense, we are all in the same situation. We need, after the pandemic, because of the economic damage, some new growth model. And we would have to do it anyway because of technological and other developments, but this has probably speeded things up. And none of us is quite sure what that new growth model should be. But the stakes are much higher for China than for the US or for Singapore. Why? Because, let us say, there is a prolonged recession in the US with huge, massive job losses, even more than already. What is the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is that Mr. Trump and his government lose their jobs and are replaced by a new government. The system itself is not destroyed, is not shaken. But in China, the systemic consequences of a prolonged recession are much greater. My final point is, and let's get to the question and answer, is I started by saying I have been reading far too much hyperbolic commentary. Among those commentaries are many, and I'm sure you read them too, that seem to suggest that we are going to undergo deglobalization. I don't think this is going to happen. I think both the US and China are finding that decoupling is much easier to talk about than to actually implement. It may be possible in certain domains, but not over the board, because they are too much intertwined in a way that the US and the former Soviet Union are not intertwined. However, deglobalization has been under stress. It has been under stress for quite some time. We in Singapore, in particular, and we are not alone globally in this matter, tend to think of globalization as the natural order of things. American-led globalization. And that's quite understandable because we have benefited greatly from it. But my dear friends, it is not the natural order of things. The period when American-led globalization seemed to be the only sort of international order was historically a very short and exceptional period. Very short because it's maybe from 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, to around 2008, 2009, when the global financial crisis broke out. More normally, international order has been divided, it has been contested. That was the case during the Cold War, that was the case before the Cold War, and we are now entering again into a more historically normal period of a divided and contested international order. But the divisions are never going to be as absolute as they were during the Cold War. And I think both the Chinese and Americans are beginning to find this out particularly in the technology sector. What we are going into is a period of, how shall I say, fragmented globalization, where supply chains are going to be reoriented. That already began before the pandemic. The pandemic will probably enhance this trend. How much they will be reoriented, how much you can have reshoring or nearshoring remains to be seen. I tend to think that while people were trying to hedge their China risks even before the pandemic, the risk of too much dependence on China for various supply chains, is going to be, again, one of those things that's easier to talk about diversification than actually doing it. If some of you may recall that for at least 15 years or more, Japan has been trying to pursue a China +1 strategy, which is a form of hedging against overdependence on China. And they have never quite been able to find a +1. And I suspect, anyway, I don't know, that will still be the case after the pandemic. But people are certainly going to try, and some reorientation of supply chains have already begun, and there will be probably more. What we do not know is how much of this is going to happen. We don't know yet. We will find out over time. Now, let me stop here and let's have a discussion rather than you listening to a monologue all the time. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Bilahari, for a very insightful expose of the topic, and your views as always very interesting and informative. I may want to start off the Q&A session with two questions, Bilahari.
Sure.
The first one is in relation to COVID-19 and the apparent increase in the histrionics, the tension between the two superpowers. And is it just an election phenomena in the US that's causing this? Or do you see a more or less new equilibrium in terms of level of tension, a higher level of tension, a higher level of rather, unpleasant histrionics between the two countries going forward? That's one question. The second is about ASEAN in the context of the Indo-Pacific. Is ASEAN going to be buffeted by the two superpowers, or can ASEAN, as we would like to think, can play a constructive value-added role in somehow bringing stability, perhaps mutual understanding in terms of the two superpowers' role and perspectives in this very important region, of which we have a very great interest. Over to you.
Well, look, the election is a factor, certainly. Both of them are blaming each other because both of them have had some political damage in their own countries. And it's always good to blame somebody else. But I think that is not the only story. The domestic political, both of them main considerations are domestic politics, China as well as the US. China has its own domestic politics, don't forget that. But I think it's not just that. If you look at the trajectory of US-China relations, when they re-established relationships, contacts in 1972, there have been moments of tension, and competition is always there in great power relationships. But overall, from 1972 to around 2010 or 2011, something around there, the general tendency, despite moments of tension, despite the inevitable competition, was towards engagement. Now this has flipped. It has flipped in that there will still be engagement. They are not going to break off contacts with each other, and I told you a war is very unlikely. But the overall trend now is towards competition and tension, despite moments of engagement, moments of cooperation. Why this is so is, I think, a story of two delusions. An American delusion or Western delusion and a Chinese delusion. The Western delusion was that what drove the tendency towards engagement from 1972 until pretty recently was this touching idea that as China reformed economically, it would also reform politically and not become a carbon copy of Western systems, but something much more like Western systems. Something like Taiwan or Hong Kong or Japan or South Korea. This was a firm ideological belief in the Americans and in the Europeans. Now, it's nonsense. I mean, I don't know anybody in the Indo-Pacific that ever believed this, but this kind of belief is very much part of the Western sense of self. And it is only very recently they realized this is a different kind of major power, and it is one in which there will be competitive relationship. Right now, it is still in an excitable stage. It will, at some point, come down to what I would call a normal kind of competition, but we are not yet there. On the Chinese side, there was a different delusion. I told you that after the Cold War, the immediate Cold War reaction of the US and the West generally was hubris. Now, hubris is not an American monopoly. When the global financial crisis broke out, and it is indisputable that China handled it better than the Western systems because they had more control over their economy, China began to believe its own propaganda about its unstoppable rise and the West's inevitable and absolute decline. Now, China's rise is real, and China's rise obviously implies relative adjustments in power, but relative, not absolute. But they began, I think, to believe their own propaganda. It began towards the end of the Hu Jintao era. And from that point, a different tone infused Chinese policy, external policy. It became much more assertive. And another miscalculation, I think, was to overgeneralize from the Obama administration's lack of appetite for competition. They thought this was a new trend in American foreign policy. But anyway, so it's not just the election. I think we are in a new long-term period of strategic competition. Eventually, this will settle down to what I would call normal competition, right? But it's not yet in that phase. When it will be in that phase, I haven't the slightest idea. ASEAN's role. Now, I think this situation has both dangers and opportunities for ASEAN. I think the dangers are obvious, but they are not unique, I mean, we went through this and worse during the Cold War, which was not cold in Southeast Asia. It was hot in Indochina, at least. And we managed to navigate that period, and there's no reason we can't navigate this, provided we don't lose our nerve. Now, the opportunities are not, as you suggested, they may possibly be. I see no possibility of ASEAN playing a bridging role at present, because neither the US nor China is in a mood, no matter what they may say, to be bridged. They are still in the first heated phase of strategic competition. Maybe in the future, they may settle down and there may be some kind of role, but not right now. Right now, no matter what they say, they are trying to get you on their side. And that's not a position we need to be in. We can navigate through that, but it's not something that we can brush aside either. Let's not have any illusions about just because they come to ASEAN meetings like the East Asia Summit or the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, that means they really want to be bridged. They are going there in order to try to capture ASEAN. Let's be clear about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and thank you, Brian. We
Don't
now
call
have
me
the
Excellency. I'm in no way excellent. Just call me Bilahari.
Thank you, Bilahari. For the next question, we have Mr. Atul Terminika from Global Schools Holdings, please. Mr. Atul.
Hi, good morning, Ambassador, and good morning.
I can't hear you. Can you speak up a bit?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I better.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Atul, and I'm from the Global School Holdings in Singapore. We run international schools across the region. I think,
Mr. Atul, you kind of faded out. Maybe the mouthpiece needs to be closer to the one on your right earpiece. There's a mouthpiece mic that needs to be closer on the right side. Yeah, try that.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
Yes, it's better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. It's a made in China headphone, so sorry about that. Yeah, so Ambassador, I think from a very eloquent geopolitical scenario, let me just deep dive into Singapore. And I think I really appreciate the Singapore leadership for taking a plunge and making it very clear during early Jan, I would say late Jan, early Feb, that this is going to be not a weekly or a monthly spectacle, and this is going to be a long term. And this is, I'm referring to COVID. Uh, I think my question is more to do with the business community, and I move around and talk to a lot of people and from business, from retail, from various sectors. And given the fact that many of the expatriates who live in Singapore actually have complimented that they find it to be more safer to stay in Singapore during the COVID times than go back to their domicile countries, which I think kind of reinforces the fact that the COVID has been handled to a large extent, not just from an optics point of view, from a substance point of view, and which covers almost everybody who's affected. So my question to you is, I mean, Singapore has spent a deep pocket of 100 billion. If you really combine the damage that may happen in terms of loss of revenue in future economies, this could add up to easily, $500 billion or 1 trillion, not just in terms of loss of revenues or loss of GDP, but also in terms of future funding that the government will have to do. So, I mean, this is very unique. First time it's happening for any country, for all the countries. What would be your take to Singapore businesses and UAE businesses, and how should they navigate from a non-commercial sense? Of course, commercially they're all intelligent enough to handle it, but from a social and political sense, how should they take it forward?
Well, my simple answer to that is don't lose your nerve. Right? Because no doubt there is going to be very, very tough times ahead. I mean, it's not the world economy is not going to look. I don't think that we ever, even during the Second World War, the US economy was booming because of the war, right? But this is the first time we had, at least I can remember, all the major economies simultaneously in a recession, deep recession, right? Now, that means, how are you going to, you can't rely on only your domestic demand to recover, right? So we are in a bit of a vicious cycle. I think we can get out of it, but it will take time, right? And there will be many surprises. So let's not lose our nerves, first of all. Secondly, I think in Singapore, we are in a good position. I mean, we have been saying over and over again, and indeed, I think some of our people didn't believe us, that all our reserves are for a rainy day, right? And you were reluctant to spend them. Well, that day, it's not just raining, it's a bloody typhoon. So we are lucky in the sense that we don't have to borrow. We don't have debt. And we can use this period where things are going to be slow to retool ourselves the best we can for what is going to be the next phase. To me, always in Singapore, the key variable is our social cohesion. Right? If we can maintain the social cohesion, we can deal with all the external challenges. If we cannot maintain the social cohesion, we are done for. So far, I don't say that the pandemic has not caused some stresses. It certainly has, but I think they are manageable, and I think the government is quite well aware of it and has dealt with it firmly and decisively, quickly. Right, then now, I mean, what your particular business or some other particular business can do is, I think you know better than me, right? I can barely balance my own checkbook, so what do I know about business in the first place, right? But if we hold our nerve, if we keep our nerve, if we hold together, I think we can come out of this stronger. First of all, I think it is one thing that I know a little bit, or I glimpsed a little bit. It's clearly going not to be the same way of doing things after this. And one of the differences is things are going to be much more digitalized. This kind of meeting that we are having now was used to be the exception. It probably will become much more of a norm, right? I mean, you are a businessman. If I was a businessman, after 5 months of this or more, I'll be asking myself, why do I have to pay all this bloody expensive rent for having a fancy office downtown? I may need an office, but a smaller one, right? And there's a new way of working. And Singapore being one of the more digitalized, digital ready economies in this region, we probably can benefit from this, provided we hold together, provided we don't lose our nerves, and provided our region doesn't go down. I mean, you can't prosper in a region that is sinking, right? I don't think our Southeast Asia will sink, but I think the impact is going to be very different on different parts of Southeast Asia. And that will enhance the regional stresses which need to be managed too. So far, by the way, ASEAN has not performed brilliantly during the pandemic, but then there's no regional organization that's performed brilliantly, but it has performed adequately. There could have been a lot of stress. For example, I'll give you an example, use Singapore as an example, right? When we shut our hospitals to foreigners, that's mainly Indonesians who come here, right? Could have caused a lot of stress. It didn't. When Malaysia closed the borders so that you know how many Malaysian workers come here, could have a lot of stress. It didn't. So, I mean, ASEAN has performed its fundamental purpose of managing relations among its members pretty well, I would think. But these are the factors. One is the regional factor. We will have to continue to manage the regional situation, which will get more complicated. We will have to hold together internally, and we will have to keep our nerve. Because if you're in a panic, you can't even see the opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bilahari, and thank you, Mr. Atul. Our next question is from Your Excellency Zainal Abidin Rashid, Singapore non-resident ambassador to Kuwait. Ambassador, please.
Hey, Zainal, how are you, man? Looking good. Hello.
I'm trying to unmute. Can you
Yes,
hear me?
I can hear you.
I think you managed to, and if you could turn on your video as well, Ambassador.
I want to have a look at you, lah.
I am not sure whether it's a good idea.
No, it's a good idea. I want to see the worst.
No, I can't. I'm technically challenged, so I don't know how to get the video.
Okay, in the bottom left-hand corner of your
I've done that.
screen, there is the video icon.
I've done that, but okay, oh, it's coming. Yeah, it's coming. Yeah, hold on. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Bilahari.
Yeah.
Can you hear the video now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Right.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
That was really excellent, Bilahari. You're as always refreshing. I actually have two questions, but I'll take the first one first, which is related to Brian's question earlier on about the Indo-China context between US and China and the rivalry and your views about that. How do you see the role of India?
Okay.
We again read quite a number of views about India, how they see such a role. So in the context of China-India rivalry, in the context of US and China, how does India play a role? And how we, meaning Singapore, which have good relations between China and India, can play a significant role in going forward. Thank you. I have.
What do you mean by a significant role? You mean a mediating role or something like that?
No, you have dismissed that bridging role kind of thing.
For the time being, anyway, there's no possibility.
Exactly. But I think in terms of the connectivity that we have and the historical relationship we have, how do you take advantage of that in terms of the economic and socio-political role?
Okay. Now, let me take one step back before answering your question, right?
Yeah.
Now, you will recall, Zainal, because I think you were in MFA at that time, that we meaning Singapore, played, yeah, I would say, I mean, without being unduly modest, the major role in bringing back India into Southeast Asia and into ASEAN circles after the estrangement of the 1980s.
Right. Mr. Goh Chok Tong was honored.
Yeah, right. You were there, I mean, most of the time, right? So we have always had this conviction that India has a role to play. It is a big country. Its population has probably surpassed that of China. Right now, it has a young population, which can be a plus, can be a minus, right? Depending on how you use it. But it is a big geopolitical fact, cannot be ignored. Right? Now, India, however, we should manage our expectations. India is an extremely complicated country. Far more complicated than China, and China is complicated enough. It is a democracy, not entirely on the Western model, but still, you know, it is a democracy. And these two factors make it very difficult to manage. So most of India's energy and attention is always going to be internally directed rather than externally directed. Now, it doesn't mean it has no external role to play. It certainly has. It is one of the two major powers, China being the other, that is contiguous to Southeast Asia. It has lots of plans to connect itself physically through the East-West Highway to Southeast Asia. It is already playing some kind of maritime role. It can play more. But we have to be patient. We have to be patient. As I said, a big, complicated country is always going to have most of its energies inward to manage those complications rather than outward. So it will move at its own pace. This pace may not always be to our liking, but India is what it is, just as US is what it is, China is what it is. All big countries are what they are, you know. You can't change them. But I think India is moving in this direction slowly, in a deliberate pace, and it will continue. It's not something that can be diverted. So it will gradually, slowly play a bigger role in our part of the world. One of the major things it has to do, it has to make up its mind about how engaged, how much more open it wants its economy to be to the outside world. In a sense, it's a bit like China. Huh? China also hasn't made that fundamental decision yet. They made some decisions. They are opening up. They're not going to close themselves up. But India needs to make that decision too. It's also made some decisions, open itself up, but not completely. So they are very much alike, you know, in a way. And these are the factors that will determine the pace, shall we say. Like everybody else, for the next few years, I think they are going to be more than usually internally preoccupied because of the fallout from the pandemic. But I think they dealt with it fairly decisively, and they will come out all right, but we'll have to be patient. Now, as for Singapore's role, I think we are good, we are well placed, you know. I mean, we have showed a certain commitment to India when nobody else did. And, you know, we can manage this, we can benefit from this. Now, there will be ups and downs. We are always not very, I must say this also, we are not always very savvy in how we deal with India. We don't always realize the full complexity of the country when we deal with it. But we will learn. I hope we will learn anyway. And if we learn and we adapt ourselves to India, I think we can benefit from the close relationship that we have established for many years.
Yeah, thank you. Can I do a follow-up question on that?
Sure.
So yeah, India, I think, as you just mentioned, is really very complex. And India has got its own challenges as far as China is concerned. But recently, India also developing new challenges as far as the Middle East is concerned, including the issues about Islamophobia. How do you see this complex India rising above its internal BJP, Modi, political pressures and political concentrations to play that regional and global role in the context of the China and also the Middle East we see?
No, I think this is one of the complexities that India has, because it's a complex country. And I told you it's a democratic country, not in the completely in the Western way, but it, you know, I mean, political parties have to win votes lah, in order to rule, right? And one of the ways that they will vote is to use identity. And the identity which is being stressed by the BJP is a Hindu identity, which is a new thing because India is a secular country from the beginning, and it still is in constitutionally and so on. But these are struggles that they will have to go through themselves. As you know, I think Zainul, you know, not every Indian is very happy with this trend, and not just Muslim Indians. I mean, Hindu Indians or secular Indians, they're not very happy with this trend.
Right.
But this is part of the internal complexities that they will have to deal with themselves. Nobody else can help them. Now, as far as the Middle East is concerned, India is a major factor in the Gulf because of the many Indians who work and live in the Gulf, right? It is also contiguous. It hasn't quite, I think, completely figured out what kind of role it wants to play, but it is a player. It's not a very, it is a major player economically now because of the role of Indian and South Asian labor in general, but it will become a bigger player. If you look at what is happening in the Gulf among the major powers, right? The US is trying to rectify mistakes. For example, the 2003 invasion of Iraq and so on, that was a huge mistake. It's trying to rectify that by reconfiguring its presence in the Gulf to de-emphasize the ground troop presence. But I don't see any sign of US, for example, pulling out the Fifth Fleet or pulling out the Air Force from Qatar, Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. But there is this reconfiguration. China is moving in, again, very reluctant to get involved geopolitically and trying to emphasize economics rather than geopolitics. Russia is there. Iran is there, Turkey is there, Saudi Arabia is part of the Gulf, and there is, all the pieces are in flux right now. India is certainly going to have a role in this. What that role is right now is hard to say. In fact, I think Indians themselves will not entirely agree. The internal factor which you alluded to, the stronger stress on a Hindu identity rather than a multi-ethnic, multi-faith identity in India is a factor. I doubt very much, frankly, that is going to be a decisive factor in whatever role India finally decides is going to play in the Middle East. It will be a factor, but unless it gets completely out of hand, I doubt it will be a very major factor. Because you look at the Gulf countries, they do understand the Westphalian rule of internal issues being internal issues. They understand it vis-a-vis China and what's China doing in Xinjiang. I don't see, they may not like it, but they do understand that that is a domestic affair, not an international affair. So unless it really gets out of hand in India, I don't see this right now as being a major factor. May be wrong, by the way, but that's what I see right now.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a third question, but give others a chance first.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you, Mr. Bilahari. Just a note to everyone, we have a couple more questions, so we'll be extending this session to 10:45 a.m. Our next question comes from Mr. Leonard Tangavalu, Country Manager, Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce and Industry, IRO Singapore. Leonard, please.
Yes, thank you, May.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Bilahari. Thank you so much for the very enlightening and informative presentation. I just wanted to ask you your opinion of an economic side of the world economy. There's all this doom and gloom that the markets are going to crash. However, if you watch the financial markets over the past 9 days, especially, it is in the US and in Singapore, it has gone to new record highs. In fact, the Nasdaq hit 10,000 points yesterday, so that was really an amazing thing. If you want to look at some figures, I just said in the US, on 20th of March, it was 19,000 points. Now on the 9th of June, it's gone up to 27,000 over points. That's a 42% gain. Singapore has followed likewise, but a smaller percentage of gain. We had a low of about 2,200 in March, and we've come up to about 2,800 now, which is the 9th of June. So that's an increase of 11%. Could I ask you, what is driving the market, and is it a false negative or a false positive, if I'm making any sense?
You know, I think I'm the worst person to ask on this, because I have long come to the conclusion that stock markets, have nothing to do with the real world, nothing to do with the real economy. And I distrust them profoundly. Markets are supposed to be rational, and probably they are, but from their own first premises, which are not necessarily rational, and certainly don't have very much to do with the real economy. I think I am not wrong in saying that funds are now a bigger player in markets around the world than they used to be, 20, 30 years ago, right? Right now, funds, if you're going to charge your clients a fee, then you better do something for that thing, right? So you better be trading whether or not the real economy justifies it. Now, this is my very cynical view of what's happening in the markets, So I don't think, frankly, I long stopped using the Dow index or any other index as a proxy to judge what is happening in the real world. I think it has its own reality. So I'm really not a good person to answer this question, having a very skeptical view of these markets in the first place.
I appreciate your comments, because that's what we are thinking. It's being, for lack of better words, maybe manipulated.
No, the guys have to earn their fee from their clients, right? They'll just pull it out and put it in another fund. So they will trade somehow, and they create their own reality in a way. It's not something that I would put a lot of money in. In fact, I have no money in stock markets.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your response.
Thank you, Mr. Bilahari and Leonard. Our next question is from Mr. Tang Li from Mann and Associates. Mr. Tang, please.
Hi, Mr. Bilahari. Can you see me, hear me?
You're rather dark, but I can see you. I mean, the lighting is not good, but I can see you. Yeah.
Okay. I just wonder, from a different perspective. Traditionally, Southeast Asia the economies have been driven by. Okay, just give me a second. I'll just give you a bit more time.
No, something has happened now.
Okay. Just one sec, because traditionally Southeast Asia's growth has been driven by diaspora communities, particularly the overseas Chinese. The Middle East has been driven primarily by the overseas Indian communities. How do you see these communities acting, developing in the current geopolitical situation between the two big elephants of the global economy?
Well, I think, let me speak very frankly. Yes, the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia and the, I guess, overseas Indians in the Gulf in particular and elsewhere, not exactly in the same way, but in a kind of roughly analogous way, have been important economic players, right? But let's not forget, and this way I'm going to be brutally frank, all the overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia at least, they are essentially rentiers, whatever else they may have become over time. In other words, in countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and elsewhere, they prosper by the leave and favor of the indigenous political elites who can act against them and have acted against them historically and sometimes not too long ago in very decisive ways. Right? So they are rentiers essentially, right? They get some favor, they make money, they may have evolved, second generation, third generation, fourth generation, but in the sense that vulnerability is always there. So they have to navigate very carefully. Because they can very easily get entangled in huge geopolitical competitions which they don't want to be entangled in.
Yeah.
Right? And I think by and large, they are aware of these things. They try to get the benefit of whatever connections they have with either India or China, but without getting too entangled. And that, I think, is a wise way to position yourself. Now, both China and India in different ways. India in ways that are much more within the ambit of the Westphalian, their diasporas. Nothing unusual about that. I mean, we also try to make use of overseas Singaporean communities. At least we keep in touch with them, and we try to keep in touch with them. Maybe we can, do things together. So there's nothing unusual about that. But the position of the Chinese overseas community in Southeast Asia is a particularly sensitive one. I think we all know that, and we know the historical reasons for that. And the sensitivity is not helped by the very overt use China under Xi Jinping has tried to make use of the overseas Chinese. Not just for economic, in the economic sphere, which is maybe more acceptable, but also politically, to support the China dream by merging the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office with the United Front Work Office. This is a very silly move which my Chinese friends cannot explain to me why they did it. So I think both communities have to tread rather carefully, not to get involved in the bigger power game that's going on, and not to forget that in the end of the day, they are where they are, and they are vulnerable.
Okay, so would you see this just as a quick, as another topic? Would you see Singapore increasing trade with the GCC region, and how would Singapore position itself with the GCC's efforts to diversify from oil?
Well, I don't know. This is not something that I have spent a lot of time thinking of, but I think we certainly would like to diversify our trading partners, our economic partners, as far as possible. And the GCC, we already have connections there with the UAE and other GCC countries, and we should try to build on it. This is what Mr. Goh Chok Tong, at the beginning of the 2000s, was trying to do. Right now, I think we have hit something of a plateau. That's my own impression, and it's just an impression, by the way. I haven't studied this very closely for some time. Probably Zainul or Brian or somebody else can speak to this. But certainly, as the GCC countries try to retool their economies, there will be opportunities. What they are, I can't say right now, but it's not something that we will dismiss, certainly. We should not dismiss. We should look for them actively.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bilahari and Mr. Tang Li. We have about 3 more questions, and the time is running short. So can I request that everyone please only ask 1 question so that everyone gets a chance to do so? Our next question is from Mr. Thakur from IFCO. Mr. Thakur, please.
Am I audible?
Yes, I can see you.
Yeah, Your Excellency, it's a very general question. During the Cold War, some countries chose non-alignment. And after the Cold War ended, probably the countries became more polarized and groupings were formed, both politically and trade-led. Will we see more of non-alignment coming back in the world, or realignment, given the deglobalization mood which is sweeping the world today?
Look, the period where there was true non-alignment is a very short one. Maybe for a while in the 1950s and the early 60s. After that, even though we pretended to be non-aligned, we were actually aligned. And the non-aligned movement became itself an arena of Cold War competition. For example, a lot of my career was spent fighting with India, because India was on the Soviet side. in the non-aligned movement. And while we were also non-aligned, we were actually more on the Western side. This is a fact.
Yeah.
So non-alignment is a bit of a fraud. Okay, let's be non-aligned against whom now, right?
Yeah.
But we certainly should try to pursue our own interests. In other words, let us not be the tool of either the US or China or any major power. We all have our own interests. Big country like India, small country like Singapore, or small country like UAE, we all have our interests and we should pursue our interests. Sometimes those interests may lead us to tilt towards China. Sometimes it may lead us to tilt towards the US. Sometimes it may lead us to tilt towards India. But whatever it is, it must be our interest. And even if it makes us displease both the US and China at the same time, so be it. You know, when I was in the foreign ministry, I used to tell young foreign service officers, I hope they are still being told that, no, we are not put on earth to bring joy to American hearts or to bring joy to Chinese hearts or Japanese hearts or Indian hearts or Australian hearts. We are put on earth to bring joy to Singaporean hearts. That is what we should all bear in mind. That kind of non-alignment or self-alignment is where we should be.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bilahari, and thank you, Mr. Thakur. Our next question is from Mr. Naveen from NG Advisors. And at this point, we have two more people who have raised their hands. And I'm sorry to say after that, we are not able to take any more so that we don't extend this any further. But we have Mr. Naveen now and two more after this. Mr. Naveen, please.
Yeah, thank you, His Excellency. My name is Naveen Gupta. I have been a banker for over a few decades in global financial markets. Now I run my own consulting enterprise for growth strategy. So my question, I'm going to keep it short and to the topic for the day, which is around the Middle East. How do you see really the future of the Middle East emerging given the stresses which are emerging on account of economics with oil prices swinging, you know, the way they've been swinging and having even gone negative? Politics, you know, you see Syria is still not solved, Iraq is still going on, and economics in terms of, you know, if you see what is going on in Lebanon, where there has been a major currency devaluation. So essentially, you know, the whole Middle East still seems to be in a huge amount of flux. So how do you see the politics and the social system and the economics of Middle East evolving?
Well, first of all, I see two Middle Easts. I see a northern tier, which is basically the Levant, plus Iran, and I see the Gulf. And I think there are connections, of course, there are obvious connections, but I see different realities. In the northern tier, apart from Israel and in the long run, Turkey, I see a very bleak future. Right? And the idea in the Gulf, I see huge challenges. You have mentioned some of them, economic, social, political challenges, but I see much more hope. First of all, the kinetic conflict, the physical conflicts are mostly in the north, the northern tier, right? And that's a big factor, by the way, right? Whether it's Iraq or Syria or the periphery of Iran, you know, I mean, these are serious conflicts and they are not going to be easily fixed. You don't have that in the southern tier, except in Yemen, right? Which can be, I hope, can be more or less contained. I don't see much hope for resolving the conflict, but can contain. Secondly, the Gulf countries are smaller in their indigenous populations, and they have already begun what needs to be done, which is to retool their economies, which will require retooling their societies too. Okay, some are more advanced in this process than others, but they have recognized the problem, that they can't be reliant on one commodity forever, because it is over the long run a declining commodity, right? So I think there are two realities. I'm much more optimistic and hopeful of the southern tier, shall we call it, than the northern tier. Northern tier, I really see no resolution of what's happening in Syria or what's happening in Iraq or what's happening in Iran under current circumstances. And Iran's a big country, right? And the instability So the problem is, how do you keep, as far as possible, the northern tier from the southern tier? How do you insulate? It's not possible to have 100% insulation, but how do you do it as much as possible? I think the Gulf countries themselves recognize this and doing what they can by way of providing assistance and so on. You know?
The dichotomy lies in the fact that the northern, what you call as Levant, was also the knowledge-driven economies. You know, in olden times, if you look at Iran,
they were the more advanced economies.
They were the most advanced economies, while the GCC was essentially dependent on commodities. You know, it grew up only from the 30s in terms of dependence on oil. Yeah. So there is a dichotomy there, and I don't know whether you have a comment on that. You know, that knowledge-based economies are actually under greater strife than the other parts which are dependent on probably a commodity.
I don't think the key was whether the basis of the economy. The key, I think, to my rather simplistic mind, I am a simplistic person, that the northern tier was the more developed part of the Middle East, and therefore it was much more worth fighting over. And that fighting is still continuing in a different form, and that is the root cause of the mess that we see in the northern tier.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Bilahari. Sorry, Mr. Naveen, I need to move to the next question. The next person presenting is Mr. Murtaza Kasim. He's the country head for Singapore and head of ADCB Singapore Representative Office at the Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. Mr. Murtaza?
Not coming through. I can't hear anything.
Yeah, Mr. Murtaza, you're still muted. If you could unmute yourself and turn on your video, please. And appreciate just if we could keep to one question. Thank you. Okay, maybe while we sort that, we could move to the next question. Mr. Vasudevan, if you're ready. Mr. Vasudevan is from Diva Preservation Services Private Limited. Mr. Vasudevan, would you please ask your question first?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good morning, His Excellency Mr. Bilahari.
Mr. Vasu, your video is tilted 90 degrees. We see you sideways. Is it your phone that you can turn? Yes, you're all right now. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. My question is related to the China's evolution in the recent past and its implications for us in the days to come. Because, you know, when China was becoming more powerful, its assertiveness in the South China Sea and coming for about 2,000 kilometers away from the shores. And then later its assertiveness in the Europe and also in the relationship with the US. Now there is an evolving trend recently, and also there was a forum was formed by the multinational, the parliamentarian, even though it's a small group at this point of time. And I read that there is quite a widespread, the resentment against China. And do you believe that this kind of a trend will lead to any containment of China and its future prospects? Would like to hear your opinion in this area. Thank you.
Look, and I've written about this. The biggest instigator of anti-Chinese feelings globally is the Chinese themselves. Their so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, some of the actions they have taken in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And a lot of these actions, including what they are doing in the South China Sea, the primary driver is their domestic politics, I believe. I don't have time to go into this, but I believe it is all domestically, it's primarily domestically driven. And it has aroused a certain reaction around the world, including in countries that are otherwise very friendly to China, including in countries like Pakistan. There's a certain amount of pushback, including in countries like Cambodia. I don't want to exaggerate it, but there is this thing, right? At the same time, I don't think this can amount to containment. The Soviet Union was containable because the Soviet Union largely contained itself by pursuing autarky, self-sufficiency, right? It was really connected to the rest of the world and the world economy only on the margin, only very tangentially. Now, China is an enormous part of the world economy. US is an economic part of the world economy. They are both so entangled they're entangled with India, they're entangled with Japan, they're entangled with the US, with Europe, that even if you are trying to separate this, as I said earlier, decoupling is not possible. It may be possible in certain domains, but not overall. You can't contain China. This is the complication. Now, the point is that neither the Chinese nor the US have completely recognized this yet. And that's why the rest of us are in some difficulty, in some complication. But they will eventually recognize it. They are rational countries in the end of the day. But we'll just have to be patient. But containment is not possible. Insofar as there is a reaction against China, a lot of it is due to China's own actions, including its so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. But it is being driven, and I understand this perfectly well, not by international considerations, but by domestic considerations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bilahari and Mr. Vasudevan. Our last question is from Mr. Murtaza. We're going to try and see if he can get on again. Mr. Murtaza, are you able to unmute to ask your question? Okay, I think we are unable to clarify the technical problems on Mr. Murtaza's side. At this point, we'd like to thank Mr. Bilahari for his insightful talk. Thank you so much for your time and sharing with us your thoughts. It is customary that we usually present a small token of appreciation to the speaker, okay. But given the current situations, we will be posting it to your home. Thank you so much.
Brian, when you can, you buy me a drink.
I'll leave Brian to sort that out with you. Our next event is actually the Oil and Petrochemical Logistics webinar on the 18th of August. We will be sending further details on it, and we hope to see many of you there. Thank you everyone for your time. I'm sorry, I should turn on this. Thank you everyone for your time for attending the talk today. And if you have further questions, please do email the council so that we can address them if possible. And thank you again for everyone's time and all excellencies and ambassadors for your time as well.
Thank you all for listening. Bye.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bilahari. We'll end the webinar now, and thanks everyone.